Hi, everyone. Tonight we have a video presentation. We're talking with Willis Krumholz, who writes for The Federalist and Alpha News. And we want to talk to you about some legislation here in Minnesota. Specifically, it's House File 229, which has been introduced in the 2021 legislative session. And this is about a child abuse crisis that we just can no longer ignore. And specifically, it has to do with the fact that in Minnesota, about 85% of persons convicted of trafficking in child sexual imagery get nothing more than probation, 85%. And 74%, according to recent reports from the state of Minnesota, 74% of those convicted in creating child sexual abuse imagery. We're talking violent rape, torture, sadistic stuff. 74% get probation and never really see a day in prison. I know this is just unacceptable to the American people, to the people of Minnesota, and that's why we're bringing it to your attention. What needs to change is the sentencing guidelines in Minnesota, which are some of the most lax in the country. And this just does not reflect well on us as a state. And we have some legislators in Minnesota who have introduced legislation to bring the Minnesota sentencing standards up to the level of the federal government and get these predators off the streets. And Will has created a presentation that we think is important for you to see, to help to understand this issue so that you can make your voice heard. And then when Will is done, we'll tell you some more action steps that you can take. So Will, thanks for joining us. Thanks for doing this and bringing this issue to our attention. And I'll just hand the microphone over to you and ask you to kind of give people an explanation about what we're dealing with here in Minnesota.
Thanks, Michelle. Minnesota has a big problem. If the United States is turning a blind eye to the trafficking of children and crimes involving children, Minnesota's the worst, right? So start out on the next slide, Michelle. So Minnesota, when you look at criminal sexual conduct convictions involving a child under the age of 13, it depends on the county, but at least 50% of these predators convicted of these crimes with a very young child are receiving probation and no prison sentence. And so we'll just kind of get into the details right away. Probation can mean 30, 60, 90, even 120 days in jail, but people aren't being sent to prison. They're not being taken off the streets. And so that's the important thing to remember here. And prosecutors have all sorts of excuses for this, right? They claim that these crimes are hard to prosecute. There's things the legislature can do about that, but that's kind of the excuse. They say, oh, we're just following the sentencing guidelines. But here there's certain prosecutors that have a notably better record than others. And so, for example, John Choi in Ramsey County, he's not perfect, but he does a lot better than the prosecutor. I believe it's Freeman in Hennepin County, just for example. And so there's some problem, a huge problem here, quite obviously. But the next slide, Michelle, where prosecutors can't make any excuse whatsoever is the trafficking of child rape videos and imagery. All the prosecutors need to do is have a technical expert take the stand. But Minnesota has effectively decriminalized possession of child sexual abuse imagery. And I mean that 100%. That's not just rhetoric. Our law on this isn't even in the criminal section of our code. It's in the obscenity section. It's so bad that police officers in Minnesota routinely say that if they want to convict somebody who's trafficking in these awful materials, and not going to describe them in too much detail, but this is stuff like toddlers, infants being raped, and this is not the exception. This is what all these predators have, and we'll maybe talk about that a little bit later, Michelle, when we get into the report the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission put out, if we have time. But this is terrible stuff. Police in Minnesota are so demoralized because they put a case together and then the bad guy doesn't get put away. So it's a huge problem. And if we can go to the next slide here, and just to give some stats on that, Michelle, you already mentioned this, but for possession, and so it gets a little bit complicated. There's three things generally that prosecutors in Minnesota can charge. They can charge possession, they can charge dissemination, which means you're trading in it, you're sending it around to others. They can also charge production if you actually have been caught producing this child abuse imagery. So in Minnesota, in the 5-year study, and this is according to data from an outside child protection group, and it was basically affirmed completely by the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission report. So 85% of the predators charged with possession are getting probation or some form of probation. About 75% charged with dissemination are getting some form of probation, and 75%, and this is stunning, 75% of predators convicted of producing child sexual abuse imagery receive probation in Minnesota. So, and this is something, again, we can get into in more detail, but Minnesota is not just lax in terms of giving these guys probation, we're lax in terms of the numbers we charge with possession relative to dissemination, because even though in Minnesota dissemination still results in probation, it's a tougher crime to be charged. It's a more serious crime to be charged with, and Minnesota prosecutors disproportionately favor charging the lesser crime available, which is possession, and that stands out compared to other states. Another way Minnesota is soft on this stuff. And the problem with all this, of course, is that predators trading in these materials, the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission calls these predators possession of all this stuff collections. Like, this is not just something somebody clicked on or anything like that. These predators have tons and tons of images and videos, and they depict terrible, terrible things. And these guys are quite obviously an active threat to children. And not only that, but studies show that over half of them are actively abusing a child. So this is not just policing what people look at. This material is so awful and toxic, it should be policed even if people are just looking at it. But it's a matter of taking predators off the streets and keeping kids safe. So let's go to the next slide. And I talked about this already a little bit, and I don't have to get into this too much, but the data on how bad Minnesota is on this stuff came from Protect, a child protection group. And they spent a couple, I think up to $20,000 to compile this data. And it ran from 2007 through 2016. What's interesting is that the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission just came out with a report, and they totally affirmed everything Protect said. So when Protect came out with this data in 2016, you had county attorneys, including the guy in Woodbury, and I'm blanking on his name right now, I apologize, but he came out in an op-ed and said, oh, it's really like not this bad, but he didn't dispute the data. He claimed that they were just following the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission, but he was actually on the commission at the time. And the MSGC just came out and said, yep, Protect's data was right. So this data came out in 2016. The data coming out, coupled with a really high profile, awful case where this predator was caught with all this child sexual abuse imagery, was released on probation. He went and killed his girlfriend and raped the toddler she was babysitting. And so this story, I think it happened around 2016, 2015, and the data coming out prompted a legislative response in the Minnesota House. And that was led by, and we could probably go to the next slide here, that was led by a state representative that had just come in named Matt Grossel. And he's one of the 4 authors so far of the bipartisan bill that we're talking about today, HF229. And Matt Grossel, an ex-cop, just knowing the stuff that cops have to deal with, realized this is a big problem, wanted to do something about it, was kind of met with bipartisan resistance because, maybe the nicest way to spin it is that there was leadership who thought, well, this young buck doesn't know what he's doing. Who is he to come and tell us what to do? So instead of Grossel's bills that maybe weren't perfect getting through, nobody tried to work with him on them. And some of it was simple stuff like a registered sex offender can't be a school bus driver. That should be common sense. But the bills didn't get through. Instead, the GOP Senate leadership, led by Senator Warren Limmer, started to put together a bill in 2018, and it passed in 2019. And one of the things the bill originally had was reporting language that said the county attorneys, when they're giving a form of probation or probations, they have to report why they're giving it in these cases, or there has to be a record of it. And what that would have done in effect for county attorneys who are elected and their voters, it would have been a lot easier to see, real-time records, and probably would have been good for people who wanted to run against some of these county attorneys to say, look, so-and-so, it isn't being tough on this stuff. And so that was taken out of the final bill. That was, in my opinion, the only thing in the bill that was worthwhile, really. The other reform in the bill, we could read the language for you, but just to make it really simple, is it said for certain types of offenses. So for example, if the child was under the age of 13, they're going to raise the maximum penalty for this child sexual abuse imagery. The problem with that, though, common sense, is that like right now, or before the 2019 bill, you could already get up to 10 years for something like this. But Minnesota was giving probation 75, 80, 85% of the time. So you can raise the upper level of the penalty. But if people are not getting the upper level, except for in rare, egregious, super, super egregious cases, or if there's a good prosecutor and a good judge, more likely, then it's not going to make any difference. And we can get into the other impact of this bill, which was to ask the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission to go and look at Minnesota's laws in this and make recommendations and make some changes. And we'll maybe talk about that later if we have time, but that didn't have any effect either. So if we can go to the next slide. So really right now, Minnesota's leaders are asleep at the wheel, right? And some of this was already talked about, but maybe Michelle, if we have time, we can just get into that MSGC report really quick. And so slide 7 and 8 are, I wouldn't say a little old. They're based on the preliminary reports that the MSGC was putting out. And actually in January 2021, the MSGC just put out its final report. And I spent a lot of time yesterday just going through that. And there should be an article in Alpha News coming out about that soon. But so just interrupt me, Michelle, if you think I'm going too much on time, but I'll try to go through the MSGC report really quick. What the MSGC is, the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission is the legislature created the MSGC to actually dictate what the specific penalties should be for different crimes. And it's almost like a scorecard. So based on criminal history and how bad the crime was, that helps judges know and prosecutors where somebody should end up in terms of sentencing. And so at least in terms of, people charged with the same crime, that makes sentencing relatively fair. So the MSGC's majority, and it was a slim decision, meaning a lot of the judicial and law enforcement members of the MSGC, there's 11 members, 4 to 5 of them were very against this majority decision. The majority decision was all signed on to by Tim Walz's appointees, including the chair. What they did is they looked at Minnesota's current situation. They said, okay, we'll make one change. And the change they made was to make production of child pornography, if the victim is under the age of 13, finally finally result in prison as the default, or they'll presume prison for those cases. So let's think about that for a second. It took until January 2021 for the state of Minnesota to say, if you produce a rape video with a child under the age of 13, we're going to presume prison instead of probation. That's how awful the state of things in Minnesota are. And not only that, it doesn't go far enough at all, because if you look at the examples the MSGC gives of other cases where there's a child over the age of 12, these are not cases where the predator should get probation either. You know, and a couple examples, there was coercion and threats. And in another example, the predator was giving this teenage prostitute drugs as he was having sex with her on video. These guys should be put away too, right? So this is just, again, it just tells you the awful state of stuff in Minnesota, and people should be angry about this, and angry, and we'll get into this a little bit, but angry that there's problems there's bipartisan indifference to this. It comes in degrees, and there's probably a worse side, but there's bipartisan indifference to this. So what else did the majority do? They said that we're still going to have probation for possession and distribution of child pornography in the state of Minnesota. And they gave a couple excuses. But first of all, they admit that these are rape and torture videos of young children. And they admit that these are collections, not accidental clicks, right? They're not worried about accidentally prosecuting somebody who isn't a really, really bad guy and a threat to your kids and the kids out there. But they make all these excuses. So real quick too, they admit that Minnesota is likely the worst in all 50 states in terms of prosecuting this stuff. So let that sink in. And I could pull the direct quote here, Michelle, if we have time at the end. But they basically say, like, Minnesota's the only, so they cherry picked 4 other states to examine. One of them is liberal Oregon. Oregon has a much better track record of prosecuting this stuff and putting predators in prison than Minnesota does. And they admit that Minnesota's the only state out of the states they cherry picked that presumes probation when people are caught trading in these materials. That's just crazy. Like, we're literally the worst in the nation. So they admit all that stuff. And also their data shows that Minnesota not only puts people in prison less when they get prosecuted, Minnesota prosecutes less. So that's scary too. That means that there's a bunch of bad guys out there, and Minnesota's not even going after. There's a lack of resources too here. It's not just that we're finding them and giving them light sentences. We're not finding a lot of the bad guys in the first place. So they admit all this stuff, and then they excuse all of it and excuse the continuation of the use of probation by first complaining about the cost. They say, oh, well, it's going to have 55 more prison beds a year. That ignores the issue of protecting kids. It also ignores the fact that law enforcement spends a ton of time and money trying to monitor and track the guys that are out there on probation who are child predators. They also say, oh, well, this has a low recidivism rate. Internet sex offenders, internet predators have low recidivism. The study they cite looks at convictions, and the study they cite actually says, the authors of the study actually say, we're not so sure about our results because we're only measuring who gets caught again. And it's very likely that these predators don't get caught a second time, especially in a state that's not going after it in the first place, like Minnesota. Right. And then I think those are their biggest excuses. They also ignore the protection of kids element. I've already said this, but they totally ignore studies that say most of these guys are actively abusing a child, right? They ignore studies about pedophilia and the recidivism of that. They totally just gloss over this thing to say, yeah, probation, that's the thing to do. And so the final takeaway from all of this is that this MSGC report comes out, they're committed to the status quo. This just shows that if something's going to change in Minnesota, decisive action by the legislature is needed. I think legislature, Republican and Democratic leaders in the legislature should be calling for MSGC members to resign after this report. And the only way this problem is going to be fixed in Minnesota is if politicians that we all elect are decisive and specific about what needs to happen, which is this needs to result in prison time. And so, Michelle, that brings us to slide 9. You can just skip 8 because I already talked about that a little bit. So here's what we'd like you to do. And I it's a little bit dated on this slide too. I apologize for that. This bill is now bipartisan and it has 4 authors. But what HF229 does. So one of the things the MSGC admits is they admit that Minnesota child pornography investigators, federal prosecutors, all the law enforcement bodies are begging the MSGC. They even say this, that there's testimony that they're begging the MSGC to make Minnesota's penalties more like the federal penalties, that the federal penalties for this are the gold standard. They should be replicated, and right now we're doing the opposite. So what HF229 does, and it's bipartisan, and I'll talk about the authors in a little bit, it just mirrors the federal penalties in not entirely, but in a Minnesota way that fits with our existing law, how the existing law is written. It mirrors federal penalties for child sexual abuse imagery, and it ends this presumption of probation for people trading in literal infant, toddler, child rape and torture videos and images. And it takes these predators, it's a first step to protect kids and take these predators off the street. And it's bipartisan too, which is exciting. So the chief author is Matt Grossel, Representative Matt Grossel. We talked about him. Then there's Paul Novotny. He's a current police officer. Matt Grossel is an ex-police officer. And then Peggy Bennett signed on. She's a Republican representative from Albert Lee. And then really awesome news for the bill, Jay Xiong. And I hope I'm saying his name right. It's Xiong. Jay is a Democrat, DFLer from St. Paul, and Jay signed on, which is really exciting. And so that's kind of step 1. And if we can go to the next slide, Michelle's slide 10 kind of talks about some of the bullets for what the bill would do. And if there's a takeaway here, everybody should call their state representative and senator and ask them to pass HF229. That's the big takeaway. All it does is mirrors the federal law, which doesn't tie prosecutors' hands. It gives them more tools. It's tough on this stuff. It's the federal law. It's the gold standard, and it's what Minnesota should be replicating. And then if we can go to slide 11, it just makes the point that there's other stuff out there that needs to be done next, right? The one way I say this is that HF229 is necessary. It's a first step, but it's not even sufficient. So another bill that Representative Grossel's author is HF226, and this just requires mandatory registration for sex offenders who receive a stay of adjudication, because right now some of these predators caught trading in child abuse and rape imagery are not even being required to register as a sex offender. And by the way, sex offender registration isn't even that big of a deal for these guys, because it just puts more it puts more strain on parents to have to look people up, et cetera. It's not probably the ideal, but that's a topic for another time. But again, low-hanging fruit that everybody should get behind. These guys are caught with this stuff. They should be required to register as sex offenders. Then there's other things. Back to the issue of criminal sexual conduct and prosecutors saying, oh, it's hard to have a young child take the stand. There should be exceptions, or what's the word? There should be exceptions for child witnesses, right? The child, for example, shouldn't have to testify in the same room as the person who raped them, right? That's something the legislature can do. It's not gonna turn our courts into a kangaroo court, but you have to make these things easier for prosecutors to convict, because this is not a case of a sexual assault of an adult, which are already hard enough to try and convict on. And then another thing that Minnesota should do, and this is also a federal issue, it gets into the issue of law enforcement. There's something called the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Forces. And I believe there's one in each state, and some states have multiple ICAC task forces. They're kind of separated in terms of geography. And we can actually go down to the final slide, Michelle, slide 12. So at any time, and this is from an organization called Protect, at any time, they can see all these dots of people accessing on the dark web, trading in this child rape imagery and videos. They can see it. And it's just a matter of the resources to go after these guys. They're literally super understaffed. I think at the federal level, and hopefully it's been, I think the Trump administration, as it was going out, was trying to increase funding. I don't really know what happened to that, but at the federal level, as of 2020 or late 2019, when I last checked, there was only $30 million of funding for the ICACs across the country from the feds. And that's a travesty. But then it's also up to the states to supplement that funding, right? So Minnesota has a task force. What Alicia's law would do, back to Alicia's law, is it would set up a dedicated source of revenue for this task force. So, for example, one thing that Texas did is when sex offenders registered, they were required to pay a fine, and that went to the state's ICAC, which helped set up enforcement so the ICACs didn't have to keep begging politicians for grants every year. So there's a lot of things that can be done aside from this, but clearly there's some specific stuff that politicians in Minnesota who care about these issues should get behind. And then Michelle, if you want to ask questions or we can talk back and forth, I've probably already talked too much. So
no, that was great, and there's a lot to unpack for sure. I'm sharing the on the screen for people right now the Child Protection League's page on our website that has the Protect Minnesota Kids Act. Now, technically, this is House File 229, and we just call it the Protect Minnesota's Kids Act because, we want people to know what this bill is about. And I just want to bring people's attention to this so they know that these resources are available. So if you go to cplaction.com/PMKA, which stands for Protect Minnesota Kids Act, and I'll put the link in the description box below this video. There's a few things there. There's a petition you can sign. There's a PDF fact sheet you can download that will give you, the basic facts about it. And there's a printable flyer on there. There's a link to the legislation. There's more information about the bills themselves and the study from protect.org. There's all you need to understand this issue at our website. And folks, we're not letting this one go. I mean, this is so egregious. It's just baffling to think that for so long, as Will said, until just last month, the 85% getting probation for this kind of horrendous crime. Do you realize that every single picture, every single video of a child being raped is a picture of a crime scene? And for 85, 75, depending if you're talking production, dissemination, of these people to get probation only is a complete disregard for the health and safety of children. And the points that Will brought forward about the Sentencing Commission being concerned about, well, what if somebody accidentally, comes across this stuff? And as he just so clearly pointed out, the people who are being convicted of this stuff have collections of it. And for the Sentencing Commission to be concerned about the cost of 55 more beds a year just smacks in the face of every parent trying to protect their child from these predators.
They take a lot of time. So I should clarify, the people concerned, and maybe I'm saying too much, but I'm just going to say it. The people concerned about, if somebody clicks on the wrong thing, those are politicians in St. Paul, probably mostly DFLers.
Got it.
What the Sentencing Guidelines Commission is worried about is, oh, if we finally make production of child pornography, producing it with a victim under the age of 13, if we finally make the presumption prison, are we going to put all these teenage sexters in jail? And they, no kidding, actually recommend the legislature go out and basically explicitly legalize teenage sexting. And it's I can't think of the right expression, but it's a non-problem. It's a total non-problem. The MSGC admits that there's literally been one case ever in Minnesota and the judge threw it out right away. This is not something the MSGC should even be worried about. And if I didn't mean to interrupt, Michelle, finish your point. I just wanted to
go ahead and give us your closing
sure.
thoughts, and we'll wrap
Well,
it up.
Okay. And so just, I mean, just for an example too, the MSGC finally said, okay, the presumption is prison for production if it's a child under the age of 13. But the MSG's report talks about the teenage victims who, you know, a lot of these predators had probation instead of prison. And I'm reading directly. 5 cases involved the offender recording sex acts between the child and himself. In 2 of these cases, the child was being prostituted. In a third, the child was using drugs during sex. I mean, we should have a presumption of prison for all this stuff.
Right.
And I'm not going to get into the MSGC has some really graphic depictions of what's the usual stuff in these quote unquote collections. But just the stuff I can say here, and it's still awful and heartbreaking and makes you miserable just to even think about for a second. But there's depiction, you know, there's toddlers being hung upside down, children being urinated on. I mean, just the most satanic, terrible stuff you could ever imagine. That's what the usual is that these guys are trafficking in. That's not 5% of them, 10% of them, half of them. It's all of them. And Minnesota's giving them a slap on the wrist. And it's bad news for my battery's running out. It's bad news for our kids.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, your article for Alpha News hasn't been published yet, so people should watch for that. I read the first draft of it, or one of your latest draft of it. It is well worth reading. Friends, go to cplaction.com/PMKA, or in the search bar type in Protect Minnesota Kids Act. Click on the link below in the description box and get yourself the resources that you need to understand this issue, and sign up for our email updates, because we will let you know when this bill comes up for a hearing in the Senate. We might send out an email alert asking people to contact their legislators, which you should do anyway. But
can I say something specifically about that too, Michelle?
Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, sorry. The issue right now is that the House DFL is blocking a hearing on this, or hasn't taken up a hearing on this yet. So there's maybe criticism on a bipartisan basis, but the first step is for the House DFL, and good for Jay Xiong for signing on, but the House DFL needs to allow a hearing on this. The next thing I tell people is that these politicians really don't want to talk about this. It's awkward. They'd rather talk about the budget or taxes or spending or whatever, or anything else. They have to feel the heat on this. And so, you know, in a polite, respectful way, whether you have a Republican or Democrat representative, just tell them you really care about this, and don't let them wiggle out of doing the right thing on this. There's no other option but HF229 or something highly similar to it. There's nothing else that's going to fix the problem.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Watch for more to come out on this, friends. We intend to bring national attention to this issue in Minnesota, and so there's more to come. Will Krumholz, thanks for joining us, and thanks for your presentation on this. Everybody, you can find Will at the Federalist and at Alpha News, and we're really grateful at the Child Protection League for the help he's given us on this issue. And stay tuned, there's more to come.
Thanks, Michelle.